few minutes ago, I asked our veterans if they would stand, and what I'm not going to do is ask you if you've ever been arrested to stand. If you have, you're in good company in one respect. If I can take you back to first century Jerusalem, Jesus had found himself arrested. He was in trouble with the authorities, and the reason was because the Gospel of Mark tells us that he entered the temple 4 days before. He entered the temple and he began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he was not permitting anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And the reason that Jesus did that was, well, a couple of reasons. First of all, in the words of Jesus, the temple had become a den of thieves. The money changers and the dove sellers and the merchandise carriers were charging exorbitant prices to people who simply just wanted to come and worship God. Yeah, but there was a second reason as well. The other reason was that all of that business, and that business would have been legitimate on its own, but it should not have been done inside the temple area. It should have been restricted to under the royal portico, which on the screens behind me, you'll see on the left side of the massive temple complex, a red-roofed area. And that would be the temple, that would be the royal portico. That would have been okay if the business were restricted under that, because that area was not holy or sacred space. But the area that is located, that's common space. That's space that's okay for business. But once you leave that space and start making your way toward the middle of the temple in the open air, now you're standing in what was called the court of Gentiles. That is holy space. That's where Gentiles, and Gentiles are non-Jewish people, that's where Gentiles were invited to come and worship the God of the universe, Yahweh, Israel's God. That area is not okay for business. So apparently some of the money-changing business had spilled over from the royal portico over into the court of Gentiles, and it became very disruptive. I mean, how in the world are people supposed to pray? How are they supposed to worship God if the entire place becomes just a common marketplace? I don't know if you've ever tried to worship God at Walmart. It's possible. Certainly there have been lots of prayers about prices and other things at Walmart, but it's not really conducive to a place to worship. And so that's what the temple had become. And it raises an interesting question. How did it become that way? In other words, why were those business owners allowed to do business in the court of Gentiles? Who gave them permission to set up their shops in sacred space? Well, there's only one possible answer, and it would be the high priest. He was the one in charge of the temple. And there's one of two possibilities. Either the high priest was just asleep at the wheel, he didn't notice. That'd be like me not noticing someone had set up a business out in the foyer. I would probably notice. Someone would probably bring it to my attention. And so it's not very likely that he was just asleep at the wheel. More likely, the high priest had a cut of it. He was in on it. Think about that the person who was in charge of keeping the temple as a place of worship had sold out his responsibilities in order to try to satisfy or feed his greed. It wouldn't be the first time or the last time that such a thing had happened. But that guy who did that, his name was Annas. He was the high priest at the time. And Annas was appointed to be high priest, not by the religious authorities. He was not appointed by God to be the high priest. The people that chose him to be the high priest was the Roman government. A foreign power had decided who Israel's high priest would be. Well, that's not right. That's wrong. It's obscene. But that's what happened. And the Roman government had actually appointed his predecessor and then him to be the high priest because, as you know, when the government gets control of something, it rarely will relinquish control. And so they had control of who the high priest was going to be, and they chose Annas, who was not a spiritual man, not a holy man, but rather as we'll see, someone who just was used for political purposes. Well, guess what? If the government can hire you, guess what the government can also do? They can fire you. And that's what happened to Annas the high priest. About after a decade in office, the Roman government, fired him. Why? Because, in their words, he was intolerable. He was a jerk. Nobody liked him. He was very difficult to get along with. However, Annas was still very powerful politically. And he used his power to maintain control of the office of high priest, even though he himself was fired from that position. How did he do it? He used one of the oldest and most tried and true political tools, nepotism. He got his boys to serve as high priest, one after another. He had 5 boys, and one after another, each one of them became the high priest. And finally, after he ran out of boys, he appointed Caiaphas, his son-in-law, to be the high priest. And so Caiaphas was the acting high priest, but Annas was the man who really controlled the strings, if you will. And so Annas was so powerful behind the scenes that sometimes he was called, even the Bible calls him, the acting high priest, because he was just that powerful. Well, it might not surprise you that if you've got someone who has a lot of power, they also control a lot of money. And Annas was that way. I mean, Annas would have made our congressman look really shameful the way he controlled money, because they would have been proud of him. Annas knew how to use the office of high priest to line his own pockets. And his family, his boys, were really the ones in control of the temple treasury. And so, 4 days before, when Jesus had gone into the temple and he overturned the money changers' tables and he exposed all of them for their greed and their fraud, you can understand why the Bible says in Mark's gospel that the chief priests and the scribes began seeking how they might destroy him, for they were afraid of him. For the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. And so in the early morning hours of Friday, April 3rd, in the year AD 33, after the high priest had received from some very useful information from Judas, the betrayer, one of Jesus' disciples, the high priest then obtained permission to use some Roman soldiers to accompany his own temple guards to go to the Mount of Olives just east of Jerusalem. And their orders were very simple. Arrest Jesus and take him to the palace of the high priest. Now, the quickest and most obvious route to take Jesus to the high priest's house would have been from the Mount of Olives, which is the perspective of the picture that you see on the screen. I actually took this picture of a model when I was in Jerusalem. But if you're standing on the Mount of Olives back in that day and you had your handy Polaroid with you, you would have been able to take a picture that would have looked something like this. And so they were to go to the Mount of Olives, and they would have escorted Jesus to the south, or on the picture to the left, of the which would be parallel to the red roof royal portico, directly to the palace of the high priest. And so now, here's Jesus at last, standing before Annas, and Annas has his chance to settle his grudge against Jesus, because Jesus has cost him a lot of money, and Annas has sort of lost face with the crowd. Annas wants to find a reason to have Jesus killed. And so first he tries to get Jesus to admit to sedition against Rome. One problem, Jesus wasn't seditious against Rome. Then Annas tried to have Jesus admit to blaspheming God. Again, Jesus is not a blasphemer. And so throughout that trial before Annas really only accomplished one thing. He showed exactly how righteous Jesus was and how unrighteous he and the entire process was. And so Annas delivered Jesus over to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, the acting high priest, and to the ruling party of the Jewish people called the Sanhedrin. And they tried their own trial, but they didn't get anywhere with their tricks or their sham trial either. So nevertheless, after those 3 trials, they decided to deliver Jesus over to Pontius Pilate, the governor, on the charge of sedition. And we read in John chapter 18, verse 28, that they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium. The Praetorium was only a few city blocks away. You need to understand that the entire city of Jerusalem proper, inside the walls, was only 1/3 of a square mile. It was not a large area. A lot of people lived outside the city walls, in fact, in that day. But inside the city walls, it's only 1/3 of a square mile. And so the Praetorium was just a few blocks away, but it was worlds apart in other respects, because now Jesus would not be facing a Jewish court, he was facing a Roman judge. And this judge is not just any old Roman judge. This is the Roman governor of the entire region, Pontius Pilate, who is in town. Why? Because of the Passover, this huge festival that's happening at the temple complex. And so they delivered Jesus over, and it was early, verse 28 continues. And they themselves, the Jewish leaders themselves, did not enter into the Praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. The Passover was going to be the next day. Wasn't that something? These religious rulers are too self-righteous to enter the place where Pilate is staying. Think about it. They want to murder Jesus, but they don't want to be ceremonially unclean. Apparently for them, murder would not make you ceremonially unclean, but entering a Gentile's house would. And so, in fact, if they had entered the place where Pilate was staying, they would have been unclean for 7 days, and they would have had to postpone their own partaking of the Passover for an entire month until the next full moon. And so this building that they refused to enter was actually Herod the Great's palace. You remember Herod the Great? He was the guy who tried to kill the baby Jesus and ended up killing a bunch of males in Bethlehem instead. Well, Herod the Great had built this incredible palace. He was a tremendous builder. But Herod the Great had been dead for quite a while now, and so Pilate used this building for official business during the Passover, such as residing as judge over public trials. And Pilate had with him, Mark's gospel tells us, probably about 600 soldiers, because, if you're getting thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish people that are subjected to you in one place, they might get a little rowdy. They might want to overthrow the government. So Pilate had plenty of soldiers around him, just to make sure the locals didn't get any kind of funny ideas about overthrowing the government. And so you got Pilate, he's in town. Normally he lives over on the Mediterranean coast, 70 miles away, but he's in town right now. And he's a little bit nervous. He's already on edge because of potential insurrections that might happen during the festival. And then early in the morning, he's awakened. Why? Because the Jewish leaders come, and they've come outside of his praetorium, and they got a man that they want to get rid of. They want Pilate to get rid of this man Jesus, and the charge is sedition. And so here the Jewish leaders are. They approach his temporary residence, and they essentially tell the Roman guards outside, listen, tell Pilate to come out here because we can't enter the house because he's unclean. Have him come outside and talk to us. Now, just a quick word of advice. If you ever have to stand before a judge, you might not want to ask him before the trial, are you unclean? He might not like that. But, just a thought, free advice for you. And so they won't go inside, so Pilate's going to have to go outside. And so, therefore, we read in verse 29, therefore Pilate went to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. This is the old, hey, he's under arrest, he must be guilty. Right? I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. This is the charge against Jesus, basically. Because no one who's ever been arrested has ever been actually found innocent later, right? And so this is their idea. And Pilate, he's not in much of a mood to put up with this nonsense, not that early in the morning. I mean, he probably hadn't had his coffee. He's, cranky. And here are these guys, these religious nuts that are bringing him some figure that they have this religious dispute over. And so Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. They're about to get the whole case thrown out of court. The Jewish leaders are in trouble legally at this point. They're about to lose this case before it even begins. And so they claim that they don't have the power to execute Jesus. The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." And they said that, John tells us, in order that the word of Jesus which he spoke would be fulfilled, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. What does that mean? We'll talk about that in a second, but were they correct? Were they actually right? They didn't have the power to kill anyone? Well, yes and no. Officially, capital punishment belonged to the Roman government. But unofficially, the Roman government would sort of look away if the Jews felt like they had someone that they needed to kill, and they would kill them by stoning. The government would basically turn a blind eye to that. And so there was an official type of dichotomy going on. But they say, we don't have the power to execute Jesus. Well, and it raises the question, why didn't they just stone Jesus to death? I mean, the government probably would have turned a blind eye to it. Why didn't they do that? Here's why they didn't do that. Because the high priest had procured Roman soldiers to go arrest Jesus. The government was in on the arrest from the very beginning. And so the crowd that came to arrest Jesus included Roman soldiers. And so the religious leaders can't now say, oh, we just sort of had a riot, it was spontaneous, and this angry mob ended up killing Jesus. Sorry about that. They can't say that because the high priest procured and used Roman soldiers to arrest Jesus. This wasn't an angry mob that got out of hand. This whole thing was planned out. And so now, since the government has been in on the arrest since the beginning, the government's going to have to be the one to execute Jesus. That's what's going on in their mind. And so they have to get Pilate, the Roman governor, involved. They need to convince him to crucify Jesus. But you know what? At this point, Pilate does not give a flying flip about blasphemy. He doesn't give a flying flip about any of these religious disputes. Because he himself, he doesn't worship Israel's God. He's not a Jew. He's a Roman. There's only one thing Pilate cares about: keeping peace. And keeping peace means keeping power. And so, if Pilate does agree to execute Jesus, it won't be by stoning, which is a Jewish way of execution. It will be by crucifixion, which is a Roman way of execution, and that is the way that Jesus predicted he would die. He would not die by stoning. He would die at the hands of the Romans. And that's why John writes in this verse that the Jewish leaders' appeal to Pilate signified what kind of death Jesus was about to die. And so Pilate, he's outside, he goes back inside to question Jesus. Pilate knows that if the religious leaders are calling for blood, there's only one charge they could make against Jesus if they expect the Romans to kill Jesus, and it's sedition. Is Jesus one of these insurrectionists that the Romans have to stamp out every so often? So Pilate goes back inside, verse 33. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I mean, Pilate had to have been astonished that with this guy standing before him with no army. He was arrested and bound and brought before him by a ragtag group of angry rabbis. This guy is going to be the leader of a rebellion against mighty Rome. I mean, never in the history of mankind has there been an empire as strong as Rome. By the year AD 33, Rome had defeated dozens of nations and hundreds of armies, forging an empire of unparalleled scale and relentless military prowess. And this guy, all by himself, is he calling himself the king of the Jews? What kind of king are you, Jesus? That's what's going on in Pilate's mind. And Jesus answered in verse 34, "Are you saying this from yourself, or did others tell you about me?" Jesus answers Pilate's question with a question of his own. Jesus is challenging the entire basis of this interrogation. Jesus knows that this is a sham interrogation, and he's letting Pilate know it as well. Things are getting a little spicy because it's not every day that someone talks back to the Roman governor. Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What did you do? I mean, what is it that has this crowd outside in such a tizzy? And I'm pretty sure Pilate used the word tizzy. It's a great word. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. And so Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you yourself said I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Jesus was born to be a king. It was his purpose in life to be a king, but not the kind of king that Pilate was thinking of. And Jesus says that he came to bear witness to the truth. When you think about the truth, we have a whole army of people today who say, well, my truth is this and your truth is that. When you think about the truth is not some type of unattainable, ethereal quality that's always beyond the grasp of humans, something that we always strive for and try to grasp as if we're a blind man in the dark, trying to obtain something we can never obtain. Truth is not like that. Truth is a person that you can know. Truth is Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And so people who are of the truth, they listen to what Jesus says. They hear his voice. Well, Pilate, he didn't get it. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? For Pilate, his truth is whatever works. There's a lot of people like that today, unfortunately. So Pilate, he makes a decision. At this point, he decides, I'm going to release Jesus. This guy's no threat to Rome. I think this is just some kind of religious debate that I'm not into. And so Pilate is about to end this entire trial right away, but then he gets an idea. He decides that he's going to make the Jewish leaders think that it's their idea to release Jesus. Have you ever done that? Have you ever had an idea and you convince someone else that it's their idea to do it? Yeah, you're sneaky, aren't you? That's what Pilate decides to do. He's going to release Jesus, but he's going to make the crowd outside think it's their idea. That way, if the Jewish leaders call for Jesus to be released, then the whole situation is diffused. All the air is out of the balloon. Problem solved. And everyone goes home, and I can go have my coffee. So Pilate, he's all full of himself for being so smart. He goes back outside to deliver his verdict. And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the King of the Jews? See what he's doing? He's making it their decision. And he only gives them one option at this point. The only option they have is, do you want me to release Jesus? Option A, I release Jesus. Option B, I release Jesus. Option C, I release Jesus. Which one do you want? That's what he's saying. And there's only one problem that Pilate has. They're going to turn the tables on him. Verse 40, so they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. And John tells us who Barabbas is, because it's a new character in the story in John's gospel. Now, Barabbas was a robber. The Gospel of Mark tells us a little bit more about Barabbas. He was not just a robber, but he was a murderer. He was an insurrectionist too. And I think if there's anyone that Pilate wants to kill, if there's anyone who is an actual threat to peace in the society, it's Barabbas. That's who Pilate wants to kill. But Pilate messed up. He gave the Jewish leaders a choice. And they chose, instead of Jesus who is innocent, they chose a guy that might murder their children and cause the army of Rome to come and destroy their city. That's who they chose. They chose a murderer and an insurrectionist to be released. Guess what? Pilate did not see this coming. So, Pilate goes back inside where Jesus was. Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. Now, wait a minute. Why does Pilate have Jesus flogged? Sometimes we get this idea that Pilate decided to crucify Jesus and then the Roman soldiers flogged him and then crucified him. That's not the way it happened. At this point, Pilate still believes Jesus to be innocent. And yet he has Jesus flogged. Why? Was he trying to kill Jesus? No, not yet. Pilate was trying to placate the Jewish leaders. He saw how upset they were, and Pilate figured that if he brought Jesus back out where they were, all bruised and bloodied from a flogging, maybe they'd be satisfied with that. Verse 2, and when the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. And they put a purple robe on him. And they were coming to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And were giving him slaps in the face. Just a little something about these Roman soldiers. These guys are not natives to Israel. They're far from home. And Israel could be a hostile land. Israel at that time, there were some insurrectionists at that time, like Barabbas, like others. And Israel had these men who had given themselves over to getting the Romans out. That's all they cared about. And they had certain men who were called Sicarii. They were assassins. And sometimes they would walk up behind Roman soldiers with sharp knives and jab them in the back and run away. And so the Roman soldiers must have hated living there. So this large group of soldiers, they start mocking Jesus. They're getting all this out of their system, all their frustrations out. And they're taking it out on Jesus. They're mocking Jesus. They're hurting Jesus. To them, it was a game. And you know, once one person starts doing it, another person starts doing it, now the whole mob is involved. It's pretty easy to join in. And someone got a crown of thorns. They made a crown of thorns and they put it on his head. And they found a purple robe, purple because that's the color of royalty, and they put that on Jesus. And they taunted Jesus with a greeting, usually reserved for royalty. You see, if Caesar had ever come to town, they would have all bowed on one knee, and they would have shouted, "Ave Caesar, Ave Caesar." Instead, they're mocking Jesus, and they cry out, "Hail, King of the Jews!" What a sorry sight this man was to them. And instead of bowing as they would to Caesar on one knee, they dishonored Jesus by slapping him in the face. And so now, Pilate returns outside to where the Jewish leaders are. He faces the Jewish leaders, and at this point, he's alone when he makes this pronouncement. And he's going to pronounce again that Jesus is innocent. And Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Now, Jesus is not outside yet. It's Pilate alone making his pronouncement of Jesus' innocence. And as soon as he pronounces that Jesus is innocent, the crowd of Jewish leaders were thinking, no, this is not what we wanted to happen. But Pilate would have anticipated such a reaction. He was toying with them. He was playing with them. He was antagonizing them. Because if he can get them to think that Jesus is about to be presented to them and he's about to get off scot-free, and then when he brings Jesus out, they'll see very, very clearly that he was flogged, certainly their emotions would go from, "We want Jesus crucified," and then they would see Jesus and they would say, "Oh, well, that's good enough." And so that's what Pilate is doing. Certainly they'll be satisfied with a broken and bloodied Jesus. And so Pilate summoned for Jesus to join him outside where the Jewish leaders could see him. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man!" Pilate was trying to make Jesus look ridiculous, trying to make Jesus look harmless. I mean, how could such a pathetic figure as this man, beaten and bruised and mocked and comically dressed in a purple robe, be a threat to you Jewish leaders? Certainly, Jesus has learned his lesson. Certainly, he won't bother you Jewish authorities anymore, not after receiving this kind of beating. I mean, who in their right mind would listen to the ramblings of this itinerant preacher now? Case closed, right? No, not by a long shot. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify! Crucify!" I mean, certainly a bloody Jesus is enough for the religious leaders, right? No. They wanted more. They wanted the death of Jesus. And they knew how to pressure Pilate politically. Pilate was trying to calm this crowd down, because if there's one thing that the emperor in Rome, his boss, won't tolerate, it's failure to keep the peace. And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Pilate is so desperate for peace that he offers the Jewish leaders the opportunity to kill Jesus by crucifixion. He won't give them, though, the one thing that they want in addition to that, which is a guilty verdict. But for the third time now, Pilate declares Jesus to be innocent. They don't want Jesus just dead. They want him to be found guilty too, and they refuse to bargain with Pilate. They get so riled up, they get so emotional that they accidentally, in their next statement, tell the truth about their relationship with Jesus. Have you ever lied to someone and then lied again and lied again? But then something happens emotionally and you accidentally blurt out the truth? That's what happened with them. That's what the Jewish leaders did. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." That wasn't the original charge. The charge was sedition. But they just exposed their hand. The Jewish leaders had come to Pilate accusing Jesus of sedition so that Pilate might execute Jesus. But now the truth comes out. Jesus isn't seditious. They think he's blasphemous. Their issue with Jesus is not political, it's theological. He made himself out to be the Son of God. Then, when Pilate heard this statement, he became more afraid. Why was he more afraid? I mean, was he afraid of the crowd? No. The crowd was already angry when he faced them earlier. And there were no indications that he was this fearful then. He wasn't afraid of the crowd. What was different now? Pilate heard something new that made him afraid. They said, Jesus made himself out to be the Son of God. That is what had Pilate shook. You see, as I mentioned earlier, Pilate was not a Jew. He was a Roman. And Romans believed in the whole pantheon of gods. And sometimes, in their theology, their pantheon of gods had children. Some of their gods had sons. And sometimes those gods and those sons in their theology visited earth in human form. That's what they believed. And the last thing Pilate needs is some divine person to come to earth and visit him. Matthew's gospel tells us that Pilate's wife even had a dream the night before that Jesus would make them suffer. And so she was afraid of Jesus. And not only that, you've got his wife has a dream. These guys are saying he claims to be the Son of God. And guess what he just did a few minutes before? He just had Jesus flogged. The possibility that Jesus might be divine could have been a nice thing to know from the outset before I had him flogged. Pilate is scared. So what is Pilate going to do now? He goes back inside with Jesus. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. When Pilate asked him, "Where are you from?" he's not saying, "What's your hometown?" He's not saying that. Pilate is saying, "Are you from this planet or are you divine? Where are you from?" Now, this was a golden opportunity for Jesus to get out of being crucified if he wanted to. All Jesus has to say is, "I'm the Son of the Most High God of heaven, the creator of the universe." If Jesus says those words, Pilate won't touch him anymore. Pilate will let him go. But what do we read? Jesus gave him no answer. Why? Because Jesus was obedient to the Father, obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Pilate said to him, "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Pilate is giving him an option. He's saying, "Tell me plainly that you're divine and I'll release you. But if you don't, I have the power to crucify you." Notice that Pilate is claiming to have the authority to carry out capital punishment. Some people say that Jesus is against capital punishment. But Jesus says just the opposite. Jesus answered in verse 11. He said, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Jesus didn't tell Pilate that capital punishment is not ordained by God, that the government doesn't have the authority to carry out capital punishment. In fact, Jesus affirms that it is ordained by God, and that God gave Pilate the authority to carry out capital punishment. Pilate's only sin in using the power of capital punishment that God gave him was if he used it wrongly. However, the high priest, the person who delivered Jesus over to Pilate, was guilty of a greater sin. Not only was Jesus innocent, but the high priest had no authority to carry out capital punishment or coerce the governing authorities to carry it out. So Pilate goes back outside to face the Jewish leaders again. As a result of this, Pilate kept seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself to be a king opposes Caesar." I mean, Pilate clearly, even this late in the whole stage, wants to release Jesus. I mean, after all, as far as he knew, Jesus might be divine. Pilate wasn't sure. But the Jewish leaders ratcheted up the pressure even more. They played their trump card, Caesar. They were ready to accuse Pilate, the governor, of betraying Caesar Tiberius, the emperor. That phrase that they used, friend of Caesar, that was a title that the Caesar used to bestow only upon certain elite people who showed undying loyalty to Caesar. And that would have been Pilate's ultimate goal in life, for the Caesar himself to declare Pilate a friend of Caesar. And so, if Pilate failed to crucify someone who people called a king, Pilate was going to be judged for it. At this point, Pilate is backed into a corner. He has no more bluffs. There's no play here. If he goes all in, he'll lose, and he knows it. He is in a weak negotiating position, and now it's all about self-preservation. The Jewish leaders are a threat to his power, a threat to his position, and they're using Jesus as the weapon and as the victim against Pilate. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Pilate only has one thing at his disposal in his position, and he's going to use it. He's going to sit in his official throne as judge. He could have just made his judgment standing up, but he doesn't. He wants to make a grand show of things, just to remind everybody in the room just how powerful he is. He sits down in his judgment seat. He has Jesus, the accused, brought out, and with all the pomp and the circumstance of his position, Pilate sits down in the elevated judgment seat, sitting above the crowd. It was called the Bema seat. And he renders his judgment in front of his subjects. And when the judge is sitting in the Bema seat, according to Pilate's beliefs, he was also making a judgment in front of all the gods that might be watching. And then John goes out of his way to tell us the day and the time that this judgment is going to be pronounced. John writes, now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Why is that important? The day of the preparation of the Passover was the day immediately preceding the Passover. And the 6th hour of that day was when Jews began their preparations for Passover in earnest. At the 6th hour of that day, no one did any more labor at that point. At the 6th hour, Jewish families would they'd go around the house collecting an leaven, and they would burn it. At the 6th hour, the lambs would begin to be slaughtered and prepared for the Passover meal. John tells us that is the day and that is the time, because there's no more labor or striving that needs to be done, because within a few hours, Jesus would say, it is finished. Leaven, which represents sin, would be dealt with by Jesus on the cross. And Jesus, our Passover lamb, was being prepared for his slaughter by being sentenced to death. And so Pilate is sitting in the judgment seat. He knows the score. He knows that he lost his argument against the Jewish leaders. He wants Jesus released, but they're ready to accuse Pilate of treason. And so Pilate decides, even though I lost, I'm going to antagonize these Jewish leaders one more time. He brings Jesus out completely beaten and bruised and mockingly dressed in purple. And he said to the Jews, behold, your king. They couldn't stand it when he did that, when he antagonized them like that. So they cried out, away with him, away with him, crucify him. The leaders of the Jewish nation directly called for the crucifixion of Jesus. Earlier, this is the second time they called out crucify. Earlier they called out crucify, crucify. This time they made it personal. They said crucify him. Crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. I mean, not only is Pilate continuing to antagonize the Jewish leaders, he's also leaving the decision in their hands. He doesn't think Jesus did anything worthy of death, so he doesn't want the responsibility of killing Jesus, for killing an innocent man. But no matter how you slice it, he had the power to release Jesus, and if he were a principled man, he would have. But look at the chief priest's response. They said, we have no king but Caesar. If you know your Bible and you know your Jewish history, you remember that there was a time after God had led Israel out of the wilderness, away from Egypt. He had rescued them from Egypt. Within a few generations, they were demanding a king. And God warned them against it. And he said, I am your king. Well, now, Israel's rejection of God as king has become explicit. The chief priests formally rejected God as king by saying, "We have no king but Caesar." The irony is that they were accusing Jesus of blasphemy, but they were the ones committing it by claiming that even God is not their king. So, he then delivered him, Jesus, over to them, the Roman soldiers, to be crucified. A little phrase, delivered him over. It's an interesting phrase. Pilate delivered him over to the Roman soldiers. If you do a search of delivering over in the Bible, it will tell you exactly who's responsible for killing Jesus. I mean, maybe Judas Iscariot was responsible for killing Jesus, because Judas Iscariot said to the chief priest, "What are you willing to give me to deliver him to you?" Maybe the chief priests were responsible, because the Bible says they bound him, they led him away, and delivered him to Pilate the governor. They said, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." Matthew tells us, for he, Pilate, knew that because of envy, they had delivered him over. Maybe the chief priests were guilty for delivering him over. Maybe Pontius Pilate was responsible, because he was the one who delivered him over to be crucified. Luke 23 says that he delivered Jesus to their will. John tells us, so then he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Maybe he was responsible. Maybe all of us, maybe Gentiles and Jews were responsible. Jesus said to his disciples that the Son of Man will be delivered over to the Gentiles. Jesus said to Pilate, "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews." So maybe it was Gentiles, maybe it was Jews who were responsible. And all of this is true. It depends on how you look at it. It depends on who you want to blame. But we're leaving someone out. Maybe you and I are responsible. Romans 4:25 says, "He who was delivered over on account of our transgressions and was raised on account of our justification." Jesus was delivered over to death because of our sin. We are culpable. We are the reason Jesus died. But perhaps the most shocking thing we could ever imagine is this truth that I'm about to share. Behind it all, there was someone who used Judas's betrayal, who used the chief priest's jealousy, who used Pontius Pilate's cowardice, who used the Gentiles' ignorance, who used the Jews' rebellion, and who used our own wickedness to deliver Jesus over. And it was God the Father. Peter said, "This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of lawless men and put him to death." Paul writes, "He who indeed did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" Ultimately, something deeper than betrayal or jealousy or cowardice or ignorance or rebellion or wickedness put Jesus on that cross. It was the Father's love. His love for you that put Jesus on that cross. How great the Father loves us, that He would be willing to do that with His own Son for you. The Bible tells us very plainly that if you will believe and trust in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. What does that mean? That means that you're not trying to get God to look upon you favorably by being good. You're not trying to get God to look upon you favorably by being religious. But instead, you simply trust in what Jesus did on the cross for you. if you will trust in that for your salvation, then God will save you. Jesus will come into your life. The Spirit of God will dwell with you forever. And you will get all of the glorious rewards that Scripture talks about. You'll get heaven. You'll get a resurrected body someday. You'll get to be with God forever, forever and ever. And it can start today. If you'll say, yes, I trust Jesus. Would you do that?